Hello and welcome to this digital conversation at the Observer Research Foundation. I have with me today a very distinguished guest, Professor C. Mohan, who is the Director, Institute of South Asian Studies, Singapore. A very warm welcome to you, C. Mohan.
Thank you.
And it's always a pleasure to talk to you, especially if it concerns China. And we've seen last week the India-China face-off, the bloody face-off has actually it has raised many questions vis-a-vis India-China relationship. There is this question that is it the time to reset the India-China relationship? Does India really need to recraft its China policy? You have also written in one of your articles that all the illusions that surrounded India's China policy, it's now time to face the reality, and the illusions have faded or should at least fade, because China seems to be advancing the timeline where it sees itself as the center of the world and a global leader. It's also happening because we do not see the US leadership anywhere. So now China is saying that it is very determined. It does not want to see any competition in the neighborhood. So can the Galwan clash be a turning point now? And what were the illusions that were really surrounding our China policy?
No, I think the first step as we look at the relationship today is really to complete the disengagement in eastern Ladakh. Because what's happened after the Galwan clash is both sides have actually brought in a lot more troops. Both armies are fully ready to go at each other. And the talks this week between the military level, and there will be some diplomatic talks as well. So the focus immediately is on disengagement, that you have so many troops facing each other in a tense situation. So anything could go wrong. So the first priority is to be able to de-escalate and disengage. Now that brings us to the broader issues you raised, that one of the paradoxes is that India should be prepared for a long haul if it actually has to get the disengagement. That is, we saw the initial agreement on June 6th. While it seemed to have a good framework, in the implementation, things went wrong. This time around, the agreement to disengage over a period of time, step by step in all the sectors, that first has to proceed. So I think a lot would depend on how this proceeds. That is, if the understanding breaks down again, if we're not really agreed on a core issue that India wants a restoration of the status quo on the frontier that existed at the end of April. If that doesn't take place, then I think the matters, what you talked about, trust and other things, will get a lot more complicated. So the first step is next few weeks, whether the disengagement will go according to the declared consensus between the two sides. They want a disengagement, and how that goes. So that is the first step. The second is, as you rightly said, the first ever bloody clash that killed 20 Indian soldiers and probably an equal number of Chinese soldiers really puts us in a new situation. I think for the last, ever since Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi went to China, we've operated under the assumption that let's normalize the relationship and resolve the boundary dispute. But 32 years later, we find ourselves in a situation where neither we have a boundary settlement, nor we have a normalized, expanded relationship. So I think we are in a real inflection point, and the challenges that India will have to deal with in resetting the relationship are large, because it's easy to say reset, but a reset is going to be pretty hard. For example, if you want me to go into the economic thing, for example, China is the second largest economy. India's biggest trade deficit is with China. India's trade deficit, close to $55–60 billion a year, is almost 60% of India's total trade deficit. So this problem, we thought, improve economic relations, the political problems will solve themselves. But actually the economic thing itself has become a problem. But then you are not going to be able to completely dissociate yourself from the Chinese economy. Even if you determined to shut yourself down, because China is the factory to the world. You import a lot of things you need. Even in the emerging sectors, the Chinese investments have become fairly strong. So therefore, if you say, look, we don't want a military conflict, but I want to reduce the economic dependence on China, that itself needs a fairly calibrated long-term strategy. So while there's talk about boycott and all that, I mean, that's very simplistic, but the strategy of reducing dependence on China, for which there seems to be political consensus, it's going to be pretty hard to achieve that, because
and it's also going to be a long-term strategy, isn't it? It cannot be at the spur of the moment the decision that we will boycott everything made in China. I know and I understand, because we lost 20 soldiers, though the soldiers were fighting valiantly and they put up a brave fight. But the whole mood here in the country, this nationalism that we see, that we will boycott everything made in China, but is Make in India possible without a Make in China? That's a big question. And if we do look at other options, that's going to be a very long-term and well thought out policy.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's what we'll have to see, what the government has to say. I mean, there have been some measures restricting investments. There's some more scrutiny of the Chinese foreign direct investment. In fact, India is not the only country. The Americans are looking at those kind of measures. A lot of other countries are doing it. So it has to be, again, a step-by-step process that we have paid a big price for the deep economic interdependence, where India's manufacturing sector has hollowed out, and the Prime Minister's policy that preceded the Galwan incident, which was the self-reliance policy, that also demands a greater manufacturing in India. So I think there is a moment here where India can restructure its economy. So it's less to do with China, more to do with what is your alternative economic strategy to manufacture, internally. Which sectors can you reduce the reliance first? Which sectors must wait a longer term? So I think it will depend both on the government as well as on the industry, because for the industry has found it easy to import cheap stuff from China and then, market them in India. So they too have to find a way to think differently.
Yeah. Professor Rajamohan, the scale of challenge that China presents, isn't that increasing day by day? And also, there's been a lot of discussion on what has been the immediate trigger to the Galwan crisis, to the Galwan clash. And there is a lot of discussion and debate. We are looking at reasons. There is also this view that probably the increased military construction in these areas is what has provoked China, or the constitutional changes that India made has provoked China. But do you agree with that view? Or is it because the Chinese, the increase in the Chinese power has also increased its arrogance, and which is why we've seen repeated incursions at the LAC, and it completely shows this arrogance, and China does not want to see any other competition.
Look, I think on the territorial claims, I think after all, we have a boundary dispute which goes back to, ever since the two countries, independent India, then we had the communist China come. So we had the boundary dispute for a long time. And China has boundary disputes with a lot of other countries now, mostly in the maritime side, with a large number of its East Asian neighbors. What we're seeing is that there is, whether you call it arrogant or not, there is an assertion that is China today, vis-a-vis Japan, vis-a-vis Philippines, vis-a-vis Vietnam, vis-a-vis Malaysia, vis-a-vis Indonesia. So there is a sense, look, their moment in the sun has come. They have these claims. Now, you can disagree with the claims, but they have a claim, and they seem to have the resources and the political, decision to say, look, we will redeem these claims. That's what is new, because after all, the disputes in South China Sea are also very old. But today, what China is saying is that, look, okay, now I know I'm big and I can take these territories and I'm going to try. In Southeast Asia, the countries are struggling to deal with that problem because China is much stronger than them. In the Indian case, because India has a larger army, it has thrown the large army on the border. So it's going to be a little more complicated. But the infrastructure issue you talked about, I think China has systematically modernized its infrastructure in Tibet and Xinjiang in the last 20 years. India has been slow to catch up, and it's been trying to catch up in the last few years. And the more it does, the Chinese are now saying, look, this is going to, we don't like it. So you are a second mover. They've already done their infrastructure development. We are moving later. So they would like to see you stop it. The second, because the specific road you talked about, the DBO road, the road to the north, to the Karakoram Pass, improves India's infrastructure. And from the Chinese perspective, it creates new challenges for them, but they're already there. So I think that is one part. The second is, in the last few years, both the militaries are now operating much closer to the border. The closer they operate, the friction has been rising in the last few years. After all, the current crisis is not the first one. I'm sure it's not going to be the last one. 2013, we had a crisis in the Depsan Plains. 2014, we had a crisis again in the eastern Ladakh. This is the third one in Ladakh. And in between, we had the Doklam crisis in 2017. So the structural problem between India and China on the frontier, Chinese power has risen, the military has modernized, the boundary infrastructure has improved, and India is trying to catch up. So I think you have a ready-made condition for a growing friction. And in this, the Chinese assertive policies, the declining political trust are going to make this a lot more complicated and a prolonged challenge for India.
The problem is going to get bigger, you're saying. It's obviously, we have a long road ahead. And China has also demonstrated a very medieval mindset. If you look at the clash there, and it's like a middle kingdom with very modern tools. You've also seen the aggression, and you cannot trust anything that China says unless you see it. Now it's been demonstrated again. In fact, there's a lot of criticism that I see, surprisingly, on social media from the Chinese people who are saying that China is not even honoring its soldiers and they are being treated as fodder, which is not a new thing, but now people are talking against it. And it's very, very clear that it is not, it's absolutely, China is very clear that it wants all the Asian countries to submit to it. So when we look at this scenario, actually, what Xi Jinping spoke about, the elephant and the dragon clearly cannot dance together. It just does not agree to this point.
See, first, I think, with due respect, I mean, we should not get emotional. I know there is a lot of anger in India. So we shouldn't, describe what is happening as arrogance, or even if it is, or that medieval mindset. The fact is a simple one, that look, their power has increased. So I think that is a simple fact now. Relative to the neighbors, and even relative to the other great powers, Russia, for example, is 1/10 the size of China today. Their power vis-a-vis today, they're about to catch up with the Americans. So there is the power situation has fundamentally changed. So China's rise, So once you have power, then how you behave changes. So it is partly a natural condition that I'm sure we all know from common sense, because international society is not like domestic society, where there is a constitution, there is mediation, there is a set of norms. So even after all these centuries, it is still might is right. Therefore, the strong powers behave badly. And so the challenge for India is that there is, in 1988, China and India were roughly equal in per capita as well as in the total GDP. Today, Chinese GDP is 5 times bigger than India's. So we are in a new situation. And I think how to deal with the situation. And I think this is what has been my criticism. We've not fully understood the consequences of China's rise. And China becoming a great power on our doorstep.
These are basically the consequences of China's rise. And do you think, so where are we right now then? What should India do? Do you think the government will gravitate towards those countries who could be its new friends or basically collaborate? How do you look at the partnership or assess the partnership with the middle powers like Australia, Japan, Indonesia, all these countries?
So I think there are 2-3 issues stand out. If you define your problem, that your principal problem is the Chinese power and its projection into subcontinent, into the Indian Ocean, in the global institutions where the Chinese power is going to radiate. I mean, it's not just us, everyone is feeling the heat. and that if dealing with that is your problem, then I think there will be policy choices that India has to make. You can at least say, look, three levels at which you have to make the choice. First is internally, we need more unity, more coherence, because the divisions within India make you weaker to deal with China. So therefore, the question of strengthening domestic coherence, the importance of restoring, strengthening national unity, because unlike China, we are a democracy. We have naturally contestation on a range of issues. So I think we don't have the luxury. I think if you have a huge power on your doorstep, it's very, very important to bring together an internal consensus on the primary problem. If that is the primary problem, you should be able to put other problems aside and focus on dealing with the primary problem. So therefore, I think in that internal unity is the number one. Second thing is, the principal reason why China has become so powerful has been their economic growth. So how do we get our economic modernization? That we've had very good years sometimes, we've had some bad years in recent years, and the COVID crisis has made it harder for us. So I think we need a strategy that would accelerate India's economic growth and to be able to invest in things like science. So today, China was nowhere in technology. India started earlier than China space program. Today, China is far ahead. India was lead in the beginning of the 21st century on computer technology. Today, Chinese are taking the lead in artificial intelligence. So I think we need to invest in a full range of areas to strengthen ourselves, our economic muscle, our modern technological muscle. And the third is, what are the kind of international partnerships you develop?
All right. So what are the kind, we have to really keep that in mind. What are the kind of international partnerships that we develop? This is very important. A very quick assessment. The last question. How do you assess the way Trump has been functioning, his obsession with tactical gains in terms of trade, and also has that prevented India from actually getting closer to the US?
Look, I think people are talking about India's moved closer to the US or India's making sides. Look, I think we got to be clear that, look, nobody's going to, people are not just waiting for a phone call from Delhi to say, okay, we are with you. So barring the US, actually, nobody has criticized China for what's happened, right? So just as we don't get into other people's problems, people are not in a rush to get in between China and India. So while the US system has, generally been critical of China's aggression, but they also have to take into account their interests, their economic interests, their interdependence with China. So therefore, it is not as if Americans are just waiting to save India. Or some people believe somehow, Trump talks about mediation, Trump is the problem, Russians, our dear friends, are going to help us sort out the problem with the Chinese. Of course, we had Mr. Rajnath Singh go to Moscow, we had Mr. Jaishankar in a RIC meeting, Russia, India, China meeting. But look, the Russians are far more dependent on China today than they ever were. As I said, Russia is 1/10 the size of China. Their best friend for each of them is today, for Russia it is China, for China it is Russia. Therefore, we should have no illusion that somehow Russia is a bigger friend, because after all, the China-Russia relationship is much bigger than India-Russia relationship. So there again, I think we have to be conscious of the power. This belief somehow either America or Russia will save us is, I think, fundamentally mistaken. I think we have to make sure, okay, these are our interests, these are other people's interests. Our neighbors are not going to, nobody's going to raise the voice against China. Most of East Asia, which is so interdependent with China, they're not going to raise their voice. So I think the current crisis will have to start with India handling a lot of this on its own. But we have strengthened our relationship with the US. We've strengthened our relationship with Japan, Australia, and ASEAN in the last few years. And there have been some slippage in that, in the sense that India is not joining trade agreements. India has been slow in developing defense partnerships. So we have to start accelerating our engagement with the rest of the world. And the traditional slow, relaxed Indian approach to international partnerships, I think will have to be rethought. And again, we have to approach this on a realistic basis. We are largely on our own, but the others who might help because of their own interests. Nobody does it it's not a Sant Samaj. It is of actually people come to help you if there is an interest in helping you. So I think if you make it easier for them to do it, they'll do it. So 90% we are on our own. There could be 10% support. That I think we'll have to explore in terms of what we can give, what we can get from other countries.
All right. Thank you very much for that conversation, Professor Raja Mohan. So the takeaway is that we are largely on our own, but we have to think of a long-term strategy and put up a united fight if we have to deal with China, and also look at increasing our collaboration with other countries. So thanks a lot for joining from Singapore.
Thank you, Naghma. Thank you for having me.